Me Search. Chapter 1. Me, Myself, and Me. When my publisher asked me to write a sequel to my international bestseller, You Science, I must admit I was a little squeamish. After all, how does one proceed after practically reinventing the scientific wheel? The first book was easy. Like most things in life, I stumbled into it, a victim of fate, luck, and addiction to accomplishments. But a sequel? What else could I, Mike Oppenheim, the inventor of challenge theory, patience points, and gangrenous compassion, offer to the world? I'm a humble man. I was thus inclined to say no. Furthermore, no one likes a one-hit wonder that won't go away. I'm looking at you, the Beatles. We get it. She loves you. Yeah. I was even about to send a polite decline to my publisher. After all, now that I'm fabulously rich and successful, I don't need to work. In fact, I pay someone to open my never-ending piles of fan mail. One day, however, my servant had the day off, so I decided to check the mail myself. And you, my loyal friends and fans, are the truly lucky ones, for I found a letter in it, and after paragraphs of cheek-blushing praise, it had a glorious, magical line. And I quote, "In addition, Mike, I wanted to ask you if you'd ever thought about expanding on the earlier chapters of You Science, the ones that touch on philosophy. I could use your enlightened approach to help me understand mortality. Do you think you could extend You Science into the realm of spirituality as well?" I wanted to say no, since spirituality is a deeply personal subject. But I did have a lot of personal stake in the spiritual game, and I had been using my lab and my finest thinking hats to tirelessly explore every tenet of moral philosophy, spanning all cultures, even the questionable ones, like Atlantis and space aliens. Fearing mass ridicule, I had kept this a secret from everyone, even my wife and fan. But I had long known that like most operations of pure genius, I wasn't going to be able to keep this one under wraps forever. What you hold in your hands is the next sequence in my life's work, Me Search. Me Search is a guide to help you, without me or any other external influences, so that you can understand the main branches of philosophy and how they relate to your habits, desires, personality, and pathology. Me Search is the ultimate lens of truth, shining on your ego, helping you to see the bias, double standards, and other tricks of hypocrisy that are blocking you from a life free of guilt and shame. The only thing standing in your way is a little too much you, so balance that out with more me, and let the search begin. Me Search. Chapter 2. Well, excuse me. If you're anything like me, I'm sorry. It's hard to be so gifted and talented. Additionally, you also probably start snoring when you hear the word philosophy. So, before you close this book and move on to a more realistic story of children chasing magical objects in a school for wizards, let me sell you on the sexier side of philosophy. Philosophy is the bedrock of what all humans need. You got that right. I'm talking about excuses. If you want to excuse your behavior, and admit it, you do, look no further than philosophy. Philosophy, like wearing sweatpants, foregoing showers, and never leaving the house, is an art that somehow got a bad name, thanks to popular culture, which tries to ruin everything we love. Welcome to the first step of Me Search, turning off your mass media megaphones and tuning into me, or you, or, well, you get what I mean. It's time to stop linking philosophy with complicated trolley cart scenarios and old nude Greek men hanging out in bathhouses. Philosophy can justify any behavior you want. You want to murder your boss and not go to hell? Congratulations, you're an atheist. Do you think I'm okay and you're okay no matter what we do? Okay, I get it. You're a nihilist, which says all values are baseless and nothing can be known. There's no end to the fun. You can even justify internet fat-shaming trolls. All they're doing is adhering to the wisdom of Friedrich Nietzsche, who cited decadence as the greatest threat to Western culture. Imagine him at a party. Trust you and give Me Search a try. As Aristotle once said, happiness depends on ourselves, which was his funny Greek way of saying, Me Search now, feel good later. Chapter 3. The Social Contract. Have you ever been in a security line and wondered how some person in a uniform has the right to question and even possibly arrest you? If not, you probably think 1984 was about sibling rivalries and authoritarianism is about people who write books. But that's okay, because this chapter will help explain how and why humans left a life of nature for the complications of what we call society. Allow me to read you my favorite bedtime story, The Social Contract by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Once upon a time, humans were like most animals, living in family units without language, rules, or property, trying to eat and avoid death. One day, humans developed reason, which led them to organize some basic social rules in order to create and provide reliable communal safety. From that day on, all humans lived in perfect safety with permanent peace, happily ever after. What's that, Pablo? That's not how Rousseau's story ends? Oh, well, gosh, that's very different. Apparently, this Rousseau guy thought society was an epic failure that simply invented a new force of oppression, authority, which led to the worst enemy of all, government. He further suggested governments overtly or covertly created class systems with a group of servants or slaves at the bottom to be exploited so the other classes had freedom. Like it or not, class is a controversial subject, especially if you've ever wondered why you pay a bank for land to live on and receive a menial wage for hard work while others are born rich and don't work. If you like society and think Rousseau is a Debbie Downer, don't worry, he still loved you. On the eve of his death, he famously said, "Men are wicked, yes, but man is good." And to be fair, in the next chapter, we'll hear from somebody who loved government. Me search, and ye shall find. Chapter 4, Nature Calls. Now that we've heard from Rousseau and his antisocial ways, let's turn to his nemesis, Thomas Hobbes, who thought we should all shut up and bow down to the king. Hobbes was born dirt poor, but he was a genius, so at the age of 14, he escaped his social class when he was admitted to Oxford University, where he determined that the problem with humans is our natural dispositions for war. Natural dispositions? Hobbes thought we had 3. 1, a thirst for competition. 2, a sense of mutual mistrust. And 3, an obsession with reputation and glory. He argued that while nature gave humans sovereignty, these 3 traits also led to a lot of unnecessary death, which could be avoided if we gave our authority to a strong government. In short, he thought life and property trumped independence. Unfortunately for Hobbes, the idea of king worshipping became quite unpopular in his lifetime, leading to a bloody civil war in England. So, he came across as old and out of touch, ranting that humans were obligated to choose a chief and surrender. He even advocated restrictions on speech, which is sort of ironic, since at the end of his life, most of his writings were censored. Chapter 5, Please and F*** You. So far, we've heard from 2 of the titans of philosophy, but philosophy is anything but a 2-party system, so on to our next guest, Mr. Thorstein Veblen, who argued that social evolution was guided by capitalism, not authority. Veblen said that humans developed hierarchies because we wanted a have and have-not culture so we could have a leisure class, who proved how valuable they were by adding no value whatsoever to society. Makes sense to me. He said the peak social goal was to get so rich that you could afford vicarious leisure, which is when you pay other people to do things while you watch them. For example, in nature, humans had to hunt to survive, but in society, rich people pay poor people to hunt for sport. And then they get to claim the spoils of the hunt as their own, in the end. Personally, I like Veblen for another point he made. He confirmed my long-held belief that manners were only invented to indicate status, which is why my me-search philosophy includes no manners whatsoever. What's your me-search looking like? Chapter 6, Viva Los Baños. People love to analyze themselves and others. It's gotten so bad that pop culture now uses terms like narcissism, bipolarity, and other real conditions in hyperbolic situations. Unfortunately, this is bleeding into philosophy. If I had $1 for every time I heard someone misuse the term hedonist, for example, I'd be even richer, which sounds impossible, but is technically true. Hedonism does not mean seeking pleasure. It's a category for a larger tree of philosophy with nuanced branches that shouldn't be ignored. One form is psychological hedonism, which says our behavior is dictated by our desire to seek pleasure and avoid pain. This is reflected in many Western laws. Another branch is ethical hedonism, which says our behavior should be dictated by our pursuit of pleasure, and this is echoed deeply in the advertising industry. The pop cultural term I mentioned earlier is what modern scholars call folk hedonism, which is most prominent in America's one and only Sin City, Las Vegas. Folk hedonism defines Las Vegas because it's the idea that you can only pursue pleasure at any cost for a limited time in short bursts. Sadly, this uneducated approach to hedonism is not only philosophically unsound, it's also a bad idea, medically. Indulging with no regard for consequences is the recipe for an early and untimely death. If you don't believe me, just ask Las Vegas icon Elvis Presley, who served as a great reminder of the pitfalls of pop cultural folk hedonism, which leads to life-debilitating issues such as spandex jumpsuits, greasy comb-overs, and dying on the toilet. To be blunt, when it comes to folk hedonism, I suggest you me-search harder. Chapter 7. X marks the spot. Warning! This chapter is about Karl Marx and communism, but this ideology does not necessarily reflect the opinions of YouTube or any other parent company involved in the production of Books Out Loud and MeSearch. Hi, I'm filthy rich, so you'd probably think that I hate communism, especially when its fans say they want to take all my money and make me feel the burn. But I don't. I don't think Karl was crazy or wrong when he said that the labor class leads a cattle-like existence, making just enough in wages to afford sustenance and procreation before death. I also don't think I've gone pink because I agree with Mr. Marx that there are two kinds of wealth. One that comes from materials like food, money, and property, but also a richness of the senses, which comes from love and art. Trust me when I tell you that communism, as an ideology, was peaceful. It was merely a way to, quote, retrace our steps back to a life of harmony between science and nature. I'm serious. I've read Karl's manifesto, and it never once advocates anything like Soviet gulag camps, Chinese sweatshops, or Cuban cigar plantations. So why is Marxism so unpopular? It's because that supposedly peaceful path to harmony involves the abolition of private property, which tends to piss off anyone who has property, which is a lot more than just 1% of the world. It's closer to 60%. Look, it's A-okay to hate on communism, but you should sound informed if you do so, because Marx wasn't trying to ruin anyone's life. He just thought that without private property, we'd have mutual dependence, which is what he thought would cure the main side effect of capitalism, which he called static misery. Static misery? Sorry, I'm rich, which means I live in a world of static happiness. But I wasn't born this way. That's why I make sure to donate 100% of my MeSearch proceeds to my favorite local charity. Me! Chapter 8. Liberty and Justice for Some. We just reviewed Karl Marx and his big, scary plan to take all your property. So this chapter features its philosophical opposite, libertarianism, which is based on the entitlement concept of justice. This theory says that government is necessary for only one thing, creating a legitimate process for safely holding property. Libertarianism says that life boils down to hooks of relations that are defined by labor and utility, which applies to all relations, from trade to marriage. Libertarians don't think humans are equal, so the best thing we can do is use government to ensure an equality of opportunity. But libertarians will readily admit that this often leads to low self-esteem and envy, which is why the government's other job is to protect its own citizens' lives and property. But this does not allow the government to regulate any other affairs, especially business, which has led to all sorts of disasters like acid rain, oil spills, and disco music. Libertarians are often seen as smug, but you gotta admire the panache it takes to say things like, if you want to redistribute wealth, then give away your own money. Ultimately, most agree that what happens in libertarian societies is that a minority of the population buys and controls the means of production, which creates an unfair monopoly of wealth in the hands of a minority of people. Ironically, this both contradicts and supports the libertarian mantra, the minority must be protected from the tyranny of the majority. Can a snake eat its own tail? Personally, I find communism is too strict, but libertarianism is too heartless. Well, at least all this me-search is helping me see one thing. I'm glad I'm rich! Chapter 9. The Wrath of Mills. Now we're going to discuss the most common philosophy in Western culture, utilitarianism. This philosophy is all about teamwork. It was invented by Jeremy Bentham, who believed that all actions are right so long as they are useful or for the benefit of the majority affected by it. Basically, if utilitarianism were a Hollywood movie, it would feature only one character, society, with one plot, society, in one setting, society. This movement is not about individualism. Utilitarianism was invented by Bentham, but it became much more popular after John Stuart Mills cultivated the form we see in use today. His contribution to society was enormous, as he created a branch of normative ethics that goes hand in hand with religions and rules. Let me explain. Mills, very much unlike Bentham, believed that there were very clear hierarchies between forms of pleasure. He thought intellectualism, religion, and the fine arts were clearly superior to boozing, gambling, and watching sports. His hierarchies helped religions organize governments around utilitarianism in order to justify the criminalization of some pleasures and the state sponsorship of others. To this day, most Western democracies tend to pass utilitarian policies because they are considered impartial, even though this movement is obviously biased against the so-called lower arts. Like it or not, utilitarianism doesn't seem to be going anywhere. So, the next time you read about an increased liquor tax alongside a grant for a poet, you'll understand the wrath of Mills! Chapter 10. The Hemlock Method. I know this is a serious book, but I'd like to tell a joke. What is big, fat, and Greek, but doesn't involve a wedding? Give up? It's Socrates, the founder of moral philosophy. Socrates and I have a lot in common. We're both insanely famous philosophers, and we both believe in learning from asking questions. But I'm only famous in America, whereas he is considered one of the most important figures in the history of mankind. And he earned it. He basically invented ethics as we know it, and he also created and refined the study of epistemology. Epistemology, or the study of knowledge, is all about questioning what we know, how we learned it, and why we believe it. This questioning process is called the Socratic method, and according to Socrates, if you do it right, you discover the only truth, that we know nothing. Now, I'm not sure if I agree, but I will attest that only a person who doesn't know anything would publicly scrutinize his government, like Socrates did in his twilight years. And he continued to do so despite requests from the government to stop his antics. Look, I admire integrity as much as the next guy. So, it's cool that Socrates truly denied all knowledge, including what happens to people who won't stop criticizing their government. But that integrity came with a steep price. Socrates was eventually arrested for corrupting the minds of youth, like that teacher who gave lectures on Darwinian evolution in the South. Sadly, Greece did not have freedom of speech. Socrates was therefore sentenced to death by hemlock, which is Greek for cup of poison. Here's where the story gets interesting. According to legend, Socrates' last words were a joke. I'm serious. After drinking his hemlock, he supposedly sat on his deathbed and said, "Finally, I'm being cured of mortality." And then he died. I have to admit, that's funny, but I'll stick to analyzing me and not my government. Chapter 11, Stoics and Stones. Once upon a time, a man named Aristotle brought the concept of virtue to philosophy, but it was Marcus Aurelius, a Roman emperor, who popularized it in his Meditations, which teaches us how to use logic to avoid selfish behavior, to avoid social injustices. Aurelius was a Stoic, which means he believed that only virtue mattered. He was so virtuous that he wrote a book on Stoicism to give others self-improvement tips for how to attain virtue for themselves. Written in the year 175 AD, some consider Meditations the first self-help book, and while it's no use science, it is very popular. Bill Clinton and many other famous leaders cite it as their favorite book, and even John Stuart Mills was an avid fan, since the book criticizes the pursuit of fun. I recommend Meditations to anyone who has trouble living in the present. It offers many tips for how to shun those pesky fantasies of desire, as well as debilitating fears of pain, also known as the two distractions that prevent us from living a life of dignity. It's important to mention that Aurelius didn't invent Stoicism. History just treats him like he did because he was a perfect model of the movement. He was so virtuous that he is called the last good emperor of Rome because the empire started collapsing days after his death. And forget about Mount Rushmore. While living, Marcus was declared a god by his subjects, and he's still known as the Philosopher King, a title I hope to someday usurp. One more fun fact. If you're a Christian, even though Marcus wasn't one, he is your BFF because he was the first and only Roman emperor to give Christians a pass, after swearing that their prayers during war brought rain to his dehydrated troops in the desert. To sum things up, if you want to be revered, it seems like one path is to live a life of self-restraint, duty, and respect for others. And while I'm not sure if that's for me, it sure is an admirable concept. Chapter 12. Like, OMG! I was surprised the other day when I overheard a group of teenagers talking about religion. Instead of blaring music, they kept saying, "Oh my God this" and "Oh my God that." I was startled because this wasn't just annoying. It also refuted the theory that sex, drugs, and rock and roll are destroying religion in America. I guess it's safe to say that theism is alive and well. Which makes sense, since America was formed by conservative, God-fearing pilgrims who believed in a strict, prescribed religion with rules to be learned and followed in order to avoid burning in hell. I care about my career, so I'm not going to offer an opinion on religion or God, but it is my job to teach the history of both. So this chapter is about Deism, which says you do not need a theistic religion like Christianity to know and be one with God. Deism was created by Edward Herbert in England in the 1620s, who lived in a time when the churches were telling everyone exactly what to think and how to behave, and he thought these institutions were corrupt. He thought God was much nicer than the one featured in the Bible, and that this God existed in our hearts and was easily accessible with prayer. Herbert said he prayed to God daily, and God always answered him. He even said that God told him to write about this in order to help humanity get back on track. So, he wrote and published his famous treatise, De Veritate, much to the chagrin of churches throughout Europe, as it threatened their authority. De Veritate was so popular that historians say it led to a reduction in religion, which in turn led to the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, and 2 world wars. Talk about unintended consequences. I have to say, while the notion of a do-it-yourself relationship with God does sound appealing, I also kind of appreciate a life without constant war. So, I should probably tip my hat to those kids at the mall. OMG indeed. Chapter 13. In the Name of God Particle. We just talked a lot about God, so I figured I'd balance things out by writing a chapter on atheism, which is the strict denial of theism, also known as the belief in God and/or divinity. I want to make it clear that atheists are not against theism, so much as they are positive that theism is wrong. As a matter of fact, atheism debuted during the Age of Enlightened Reason as a way for Europeans to avoid the seemingly oppressive and dark inconsistencies of the Catholic Church, which, according to these philosophers, was anything but divine. And their criticism of religion didn't come from nowhere. The Catholic Church was responsible for quite a few faux pas in its glory days, such as the Crusades, the Dark Ages, the Spanish Inquisition, colonialism, and making people really bored and hungry at weddings as they wait for a couple to get married before the reception. Atheism achieved its pinnacle of fame during the French Revolution, when it was used as a political concept to abolish the church and the monarchy. Now, this might sound mean and nasty if you're religious, but it sounded pretty appealing in an era when a king could behead you for any reason, all in the name of God. Modern atheism is difficult to track, since many people live in places like China that abolished religion, while others live in Islamic or Buddhist nations that mandate religious faith. But even with these regimes, we can still track the trend, and believe it or not, atheism has been on the decline since the turn of the century, across the world. This might surprise science-loving atheists who think science is working towards disproving the notion of an almighty creator, but it doesn't surprise me. If you read the history of physics, it's full of scientists like Albert Einstein, who believed in a divine order behind the universe, and Peter Higgs and Leon Letterman, who have convinced the scientific community that there is a God particle that explains existence. Personally, I don't see any controversy. If God is all-powerful and to be loved by everyone, it's obviously this. Chapter 14. Planet of the Arguments. Once upon a time, the Western world believed that God created humans so we could live unhappily ever after in a world of sin thanks to a snake, an apple, and a nosy wife. And we loved this. We loved hating ourselves and fearing God. That is, until 1859, when this Charles Darwin guy ruined all the fun with his fancy-pants theory of evolution. Darwin, a God-fearing Christian himself, was studying animals on an island near Ecuador when he noticed that many of the creatures he observed seemed naturally selected for life, due to biological adaptations that enhance survival and reproduction. He published his controversial theory, leading to a culture war, as well as 5 awful movies about a planet of apes that behave like humans who are bad at acting. Now, if you're not religious, you might be wondering why people of faith hate Darwin and his theory. But if you put yourself in their shoes, it's pretty offensive. After all, Darwinists believe that science is responsible for humanity and the Bible is made up. To make matters worse, social Darwinists will even tell you that a person who lies, cheats, and steals is using evolution to survive in a world of crooks and thieves. Luckily, these two impossibly adversarial groups have found a sliver of compromise. Creationists believe that God created science, including Darwinism, while Darwinists think evolution will slowly but surely weed out every religious Neanderthal. Personally, I don't care. I sleep like a baby knowing that thanks to my best-selling books and my impossibly advanced mind, God or science, I'm going to be just fine. Chapter 15. Just my determined luck. What if I told you that everything that has ever happened and will happen was already decided? Would it help you relax if you knew that all your mistakes in life were beyond your control? If you like this idea, you're probably a fan of determinism, the notion that you're not making any decisions and you're basically on cruise control. Of course, depending on your ego, determinism may offend you since it does say you can't take credit for anything in your life, even success. But for many, this philosophy is the only way to smile in a world of poverty, war, and disease. But know this, determinists don't think your life is random. They believe that at one point, someone or something made a decision, and now every single event since then, including your birth and death, is a consequence of that one original action. What I find interesting about determinism is that you can adopt this philosophy regardless of your religious affiliation, meaning that your God of choice could be the original actor who caused all the events you're experiencing, including your opinions about this. And if you're atheistic, you can blame it on a big, random, scientific bang. The next time something goes wrong in your life, take a second to think about what led to that moment. And if you get a funny feeling that you didn't actually do anything to deserve it, well, you might just want to thank your lucky, determined stars. Chapter 16, The Free Will Pill. We've covered a lot of philosophical ground, so I think you're now ready to consider what is perhaps the pinnacle of any philosophical debate. I am referring to the age-old question, should you bite or lick your ice cream? Sorry, that's a philosophy joke, but it's also a good segue into this chapter's real topic, free will, the ability to make choices that have not been determined by past events. Free will is the biggest debate in philosophy because there is absolutely no way to prove or deny that it exists. It's sort of like how the Supreme Court once defined pornography in the 1960s. We'll know it when we see it. The first documented discourse on free will comes from Epictetus, another one of those friendly Roman Stoics. But, unlike Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus was born a slave, but he became a free man, so his life perspective was rather intense. He argued that the key to life is accepting everything that happens while also being accountable for your actions. Talk about pressure! I grew up thinking free will meant the right to pick my own pizza toppings, but it turns out to be a big lecture on responsibility and not judging others, even when their free will actions threaten or offend you and your values. Like it or not, if you believe in free will, you have to be confident in your ability to let things slide and take the high road. And if you don't believe in it, well, then you can't judge anything. Talk about a me-search catch-22. Chapter 17, A Sloppy, Slippery, Solipsist Slope. When I was growing up, I always hated tongue twisters. That's why I almost kept this chapter's topic, Solipsism, out of my book. Try saying that 5 times fast.
Solipsism, 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 solipsism.
Solipsism is the idea that the only thing we can be sure of is that our mind exists. Beyond that, all objective knowledge and realities are impossible. Yup, you made me up. There are a lot of variants of solipsism, but the version you should know to win on Jeopardy says that everything you see, feel, taste, smell, and hear is a figment of your imagination. So while all this seems real, it's not. Without you, nothing exists. If you're not confused by this, you're not thinking hard enough. You should be baffled. Solipsism is crazy. It justifies all sorts of behavior. I'm serious. A solipsist student could honestly tell their teacher, I don't have to answer your stupid question because I invented you and this class. Crazy, right? So how did this movement start? Well, remember that René Descartes guy who famously said, I think, therefore I am? Solipsism is the idea that his statement is the beginning and end of existence. If you stopped thinking, the world would literally disappear. It's probably a good thing that very few people are solipsists, let alone have even heard of it. There would be a lot of nutty behavior if everyone thought they were inventing reality. It would be like those stories you hear about people who take drugs and think they can fly. So, if you do like and believe in solipsism, please be smart about it. Even if you did invent this world, you also invented its rules. Like gravity. Me Search is supposed to be safe and gentle, okay? Chapter 18. The Cat in the Many Worlds Hats. Once upon a time, some Greek men were trying to understand space and time, so they invented atomism, which says when atoms smash into each other, a new universe is created. Centuries later, a Roman Stoic named Chrysippus took that idiotic idea to the next level, claiming that the universe is in a perpetual stage of expiration or regeneration, which obviously proves that infinite multiple universes exist across time. Duh. Luckily, no one took these crackpot ideas very seriously, since there isn't any evidence for them in our daily lives or even in lab experiments. However, all that changed in 1952 when a mathematician named Erwin Schrödinger claimed that until an event is observed, all possible outcomes of the event are occurring simultaneously in superposition, which led to the many worlds theory, also known as the lame, boring backbone for a lot of stupid superhero movies you see these days. So now you understand both quantum physics and multiverse theory. What's that? You want a better explanation? Okay, but don't say we didn't warn you, because that's going to require exposing you to some animal torture, something Pablo and I are entirely against. I am referring to the legendary tale of Schrödinger's cat, the so-called proof of superposition and the many worlds theory. In order to prove the existence of infinite possibility, Schrödinger used the example of a cat trapped in a box with radioactive contaminants and a vial of poison to prove how a cat can be considered both alive and dead at the same time, until the moment someone bothers to look in the box. Personally, I'm an animal lover, so even if Schrödinger has a bunch of fellow nerds who agree with him, I'm going to take a hard pass on any philosophy that hinges on animal abuse. Furthermore, this idea is stupid.
There's only one reality. We all know that. Only an idiot would buy into such an obviously impossible concept.
Chapter 19. People Force Problems. Welcome to the penultimate chapter of Me Search. You're now an expert on social contracts, nature, society, hedonism, Marxism, libertarianism, Darwinism, and utilitarianism. You can even discuss the Socratic method, Stoicism, Deism, Atheism, determinism, free will, Solipsism, and the many worlds theory. But while all that was excellent priming for your Me Search, don't rest now, because this chapter's topic is every armchair philosopher's favorite subject to misunderstand. Democracy. Yup, it's a philosophical fact that most people think they know exactly what democracy is, when that's next to impossible, since more than 2,234 descriptions of a democracy exist in the English language alone. Democracy is a lot like a family vacation. It sounds great in theory, but often leads to incredibly hostile feelings and resentment on all sides. So how did this misunderstanding begin? If you go back to its roots, democracy is a Greek word that combines the words people with force, and the first example of this people force was in the city-state of Athens in 508 BC. In this era, people who were classified as citizens were given the right to meet in assembly, argue about decisions, and then vote on them. But before you stand up and wave your flags, you should know that only 1 in 4 people at that time were considered citizens. This means 75% of this democracy was held at the mercy or force of the other 25%. And sadly, this is the template for every democracy since that time. To this day, the problem with democracy is the issue of who gets to vote and for what. For example, Even though the term gerrymandering comes from America in 1812, ancient Romans used the same idea, with a different name, to screw over, maintain, certain results for their electorate, just like many countries today. Like it or not, unless you let everyone vote on everything and you don't let anyone veto any of those decisions, you are not living in a pure democracy. To be frank, our watered-down systems of people force probably need some more specific names. Look, I love to pat myself on the back as much as the next guy, but no democracy on record has given everyone an equal vote, which means when it comes to democracy, there's always a group that feels like a kid with their parents, no matter what their government tells them about freedom and voting. The next time you're celebrating your nation's independence, just remember that you're celebrating a nation and its version of democracy, not democracy itself. Democracies are a lot like Fortune 500 companies, meaning they have an executive council that excels at marketing, branding, and sales. If this chapter damaged your love for democracy, let me ease your budding angst with a quote from the late, great Sir Winston Churchill. The best argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the average voter. Comforting, right? Chapter 20. Anarchy in the You Don't Say? When Emma Goldman wrote that ignorance is the most violent element of society, it was long before video games about stealing cars with hookers and movies about action heroes taking revenge. But like it or not, she helped move the fringe concept of anarchy into the mainstream political conversation. But the history of anarchy started well before Goldman's Anarchy Journal in 1906. The first known use was in 1539, when it referred to an absence of government. The basic idea was that government and law creates hierarchies and restrictions on liberty, but when citizens try to change or abolish these oppressive forces, the government uses violence to repel those efforts, which is inherently unfair. Anarchists believe that the only solution for this is to live in the spirit of revolt, which doesn't have to be violent, but cannot be hindered by rigged systems like voting. Anarchy is the philosophy that government does not diminish or even minimize crime, because crime is misdirected energy created by oppression. So all people must take direct action against any and all oppression for the sovereignty of the individual. Now, I know what you're thinking. These people sure do use a lot of violent language in a discussion about liberty and safety. But they do make a decent point when they say that most great social gains have come from revolutions. The problem most people have with anarchy, if you take violence out of the equation, is that it does not seem to offer stability or safety. Well, that's sort of the point. What Goldman and others believe is that religion, property, and government enslave people into a life of laziness and yearning for special privileges. But without these oppressive, hierarchical forces, social harmony would grow naturally out of a solidarity of interests. I'm actually a huge fan of anarchy. That's why I don't sign any contracts with my television crew. I don't even pay most of them. It's great. You should give it a... Oh, no, stop, no!